The year is 1861. The place is the deep, sweating heart of Florida. It is a land where the heat does not just sit on you, it owns you. It seeps into the pores of the skin and the cracks of the floorboards. The air here is heavy, thick with the scent of rotting vegetation, Spanish moss, and the salt rising off the swamps. In this time, the world is holding its breath. The country is splitting in two, tearing itself apart at the seams, and the rumble of war is just a distant thunder on the horizon. But on the isolated plantation of Silas Thorne, the war has already begun. It is not a war of cannons or muskets. It is a silent war. A war of wills between a man who believes he owns the earth beneath his feet and a woman who owns nothing but the silence inside her throat. Her name was Ada. You need to picture her clearly. She was not a woman who walked with her head down. Even when the lash was a threat, even when the sun beat down hard enough to blister stone, Ada moved with a terrifying grace. She was the house servant, the one who poured the wine and dusted the heavy velvet curtains that were far too thick for the Florida heat. But the thing that everyone noticed, the thing that made the other enslaved folks look at her with a mixture of awe and fear, was her voice. Or rather, the lack of it. For 3 months, Ada had not spoken a single word. Not a whisper. Not a cry. Not a plea. Silas Thorne was a man who required noise. He was a man of bluster and shouting. He liked the sound of his own boots on the hardwood. He liked the sound of the dogs baying in the kennels. He liked the sound of agreement. Silence to a man like Silas felt like judgment. It felt like a mirror he couldn't break. When he walked into a room, he expected the air to shift. He expected fear to be audible. But Ada gave him nothing. She would pour his coffee with a hand that did not shake, her eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder, and she would offer him absolutely nothing. No, yes, master. No, no, master. Just a silence so profound it seemed to suck the sound out of the rest of the room. It started slowly, this obsession of his. At first, he thought she was simply being stubborn. He thought a few days in the hot box or a withheld meal would loosen her tongue. But Ada was made of something different. She took the heat, took the hunger. And when she came back into the main house, gaunt and thirsty, her lips were pressed together in a line as straight and hard as the horizon. It drove him mad. You have to understand the psychology of a tyrant. A tyrant needs validation. He needs to know that his power is real. If he hurts you, he needs to hear you scream. If he commands you, he needs to hear you submit. Without that feedback, he is just a man shouting at a wall. And Silas Thorne was terrified of being just a man. The rumors started spreading through the quarters. The others whispered that Ada had been cursed or that she had seen a ghost in the swamp that stole her voice. But the truth was far more dangerous. Ada had simply decided that her voice was the only thing he couldn't take. He could take her labor. He could take her freedom. He could take her children if she had any. But he couldn't take her words if she didn't give them to him. It was a rebellion. A rebellion fought without weapons, without violence, simply by refusing to participate in the reality he had built. The night it happened, the moon was full and yellow, hanging low over the cypress trees like a watching eye. The humidity was unbearable. The insects were screaming in the dark, a deafening chorus of crickets and cicadas. Silas had been drinking. The whiskey was dark and expensive, but it wasn't doing the job of calming his nerves. He had received a letter that morning. Talk of the Union blockade. Talk of money drying up. His world was fragile and he knew it. He sat in his study, the oil lamp casting long, flickering shadows against the bookshelves. He rang the bell. Ada appeared. She didn't make a sound when she walked. That was another thing that unnerved him. She just appeared in the doorway waiting. Silas looked at her. He looked at the defiance etched into the stillness of her face. He stood up, swaying slightly. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He walked over to her close enough to smell the scent of lye soap and rain on her skin. He asked her a question. It doesn't matter what the question was. It was trivial, something about the inventory or the horses, but he didn't care about the answer. He just wanted to hear her speak. He wanted to break the spell. "Answer me," he growled. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. Ada looked at him. Her eyes were dark, unreadable. She blinked once, slow and deliberate. But her lips did not part. The silence stretched out between them. It felt physical, like a wire being pulled tighter and tighter. Silas slammed his hand against the wall. Dust motes danced in the lamplight. "I said, answer me, girl. Do you think you are above me? Do you think you can stand there in my house, eat my food, and deny me a simple word? Still nothing. Not even a flinch. And that was the moment. That was the moment the human part of Sela's thorn died and the monster took the wheel. He saw her silence not as a defense but as an insult. He saw it as a weapon she was pointing right at his throat. If she wouldn't speak, he reasoned in his whiskey-soaked brain, then she had no use for the tool that did the speaking. It was a twisted, horrific logic, but to him, in that room in that year, it made perfect sense. He would fix her. He would fix the silence by making it permanent. He would make it so that her silence was no longer her choice but his command. He reached into his belt and pulled out a knife. It was a hunting knife, the blade dull with use but sturdy. The handle was bone. He grabbed her. Ada struggled then. She was strong, forged by labor, but he was heavy and fueled by a rage that had been building for months. He dragged her toward the heavy oak desk. The lamp flickered wildly, casting shadows that looked like demons dancing on the walls. The sounds of the struggle were muffled, the scraping of boots, the thud of a body against wood, the heavy breathing of a man who had lost his soul. But she didn't scream, even then, even when she knew. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a sound. The act itself is not something to dwell on with pleasure, but we must acknowledge the horror of it to understand the darkness of this history. It was brutal. It was messy. It was the act of a butcher. When it was done, silence didn't just fill the room, it drowned it. Sela stood back, breathing hard, his hands stained with the evidence of his sin. He looked down at her, expecting to see brokenness, expecting to see a creature reduced to nothing. But as Ada lay there, amidst the blood and the horror, she raised her eyes to his, and in that look there was no defeat. There was a promise, a cold, hard promise that echoed louder than any scream could have. He had taken her tongue. But he had not taken her voice. He had only sharpened it into something else, something that didn't need words to destroy him. The days that followed were a blur of heat and agony for Ada. She was tossed into the shed behind the kitchen, left to heal or die in the straw. The other slaves crept in when the overseer wasn't looking, bringing water, bringing clean rags, their faces wet with tears they dared not shed in the open. They looked at her with a new kind of fear now. Before, she was strange. Now she was a martyr. She was a living testament to the cruelty of the man who held their lives in his fist. But Sela's thorn did not feel the relief he expected. He thought the silence would feel different once he had enforced it. He thought he would feel like the master again. Instead, the silence in the house grew heavier. It felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. He started hearing things, not words, but sounds. The creak of a floorboard when no one was there. The rustle of silk in an empty hallway. He would spin around, his heart hammering against his ribs, but there was nothing, just the oppressive heat and the shadows stretching longer and longer. He began to drink more. He stopped going out to the fields. He sat in his study, staring at the spot on the rug where her blood had stained the intricate pattern. He had the rug scrubbed, but he could still see it. A dark shape like a map to hell. He told himself he was imagining it. He told himself he was a strong man, a man of his time, and that a slave girl was nothing more than property that needed mending. But deep down in the place where his conscience used to be, he knew he had crossed a line. He had invited something into his house, something ancient, something vengeful. Ada recovered. Her body was young and resilient, and the rage that burned inside her cauterized the wound in her spirit. When she finally emerged from the shed, she was different. She was thinner, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut, and her mouth was forever set in a grim, sealed line. She went back to her work. Sela's had ordered it. He wanted to show her that nothing had changed. He wanted to prove that he had won. She swept the floors. She polished the silver. She moved through the house like a ghost. But she was watching him. Every time he poured a drink, she was there in the periphery. Every time he read a letter with shaking hands, she was in the shadow of the doorway. She became his shadow. And a man cannot outrun his own shadow. One evening, a storm rolled in off the Gulf. It was a violent thing, turning the sky a bruised purple and lashing the trees until they bowed and snapped. The wind howled around the plantation house, rattling the window panes in their frames. Sela's was alone in the dining room. The rest of the household had retreated to their quarters to ride out the storm. He was eating, or trying to eat, the silver fork scraping loudly against the china plate. He looked up, and there she was, Ada, standing at the head of the table. She wasn't serving food, she wasn't cleaning. She was just standing there, her hands resting on the back of the empty chair opposite him. The chair where his wife used to sit before the fever took her years ago. Silas froze. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, bleaching everything white for a split second. In that flash, he saw her eyes. They were burning. "Get out," he whispered. She didn't move. "I said get out." He shouted, throwing his fork down. It clattered onto the table, loud and jarring. Ada slowly raised a hand. She pointed a finger at him. Then she pointed to her mouth. She opened it, revealing the dark, empty cavern where her tongue used to be. It was a grotesque display meant to shock him, meant to remind him. But then she did something that made his blood turn to ice. She smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of anticipation. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with the thunder. But as she left, Silas heard it, distinctly, clearly, a whisper. It came from right beside his ear, though no one was there. Soon. He knocked his chair over, scrambling backward. "Who's there?" he screamed at the empty room. "Who said that?" There was no answer, only the wind howling like a wounded animal. Silas grabbed the decanter of whiskey and retreated to his study, locking the door behind him. He checked the windows. Locked. He checked the pistol in his desk drawer. Loaded. He told himself it was the wind, it was the stress. A woman without a tongue cannot speak. It is biologically impossible. It is a fact of nature. But facts didn't seem to matter much in the suffocating dark of the thorn plantation. That night the haunting truly began. It wasn't ghosts. Ghosts are misty, vague things. This was something more tactile. Silas would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that someone was standing over his bed. He would strike a match, the sulfur flaring in his nose, but the room would be empty. Yet on the pillow next to his head there would be something. A single wet magnolia petal, a dead mockingbird, small tokens, gifts. He stopped sleeping. His eyes grew sunken, rimmed with red. He started talking to himself, muttering arguments to an invisible jury. The slaves in the field noticed. They saw the master pacing the porch at dawn, a shotgun in his hand, staring at the tree line. They saw the way his hands shook. And they saw Ada. They saw how she grew stronger as he grew weaker. It was as if she was feeding on his fear, as if she was siphoning his life force directly out of the air. The war outside was getting closer, too. News came of battles, of blood soaked into the earth of Virginia and Tennessee. The blockade was starving the South. Supplies were low. Tempers were short. But for Silas, the Confederacy could have burned to ash and he wouldn't have noticed. His entire universe had shrunk to the four walls of his house and the silent woman who moved within them. He decided he had to get rid of her. That was the only solution. He couldn't kill her. Not yet. Suspicion would be too high, and he was afraid of what she might become if she were dead. No, he would sell her. He would send her deep into the sugar cane fields of Louisiana, where people went to disappear. He made the arrangements in secret. A trader was coming in 2 days. 2 days and he would be free of the eyes, free of the silence. He called Ada into the study to tell her. He wanted to gloat. He wanted to see that spark in her eyes go out. He sat behind his desk, the pistol within reach, feeling a surge of his old arrogance returning. "You're leaving," he told her. He didn't look at her, he looked at his ledger. "Sold. You'll be gone by Friday. Louisiana, you think you can haunt me. You think you can play games, you'll see what real work is down there." He waited for a reaction, maybe tears, maybe a beg. He looked up. Ada was not looking at him, she was looking at the oil lamp on his desk. The flame was dancing behind the glass chimney. She looked at the flame and then she looked at the heavy velvet drapes that covered the windows. The drapes that were dry and brittle from years of sun. She looked at Silas. And then she stepped forward, not toward him, toward the door. She turned the key in the lock. The click was the loudest sound in the world. Silas stood up, his hand going for the pistol. "What do you think you're doing?" Ada turned back to him. She reached into the pocket of her apron. Silas raised the gun. "Don't move, I'll kill you where you stand." She didn't pull out a weapon, she pulled out a box of matches. Silas laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "You're going to burn the house down with you in it. You're insane." Ada struck a match. The sound of the flare hiss was sharp. She held the flame up. It illuminated her face, casting deep shadows in her eye sockets. She didn't look insane, she looked calm, she looked like a judge delivering a verdict. She tossed the match, not at the curtains, but onto the desk, right onto the pile of papers, the ledgers, the deeds to the land, the bills of sale for human souls. The dry paper caught instantly. "You stupid wench," Silas roared, dropping the gun to swat at the flames. But Ada wasn't done. She moved with that terrifying speed again. She grabbed the bottle of whiskey sitting on the side table and smashed it against the curtains. The alcohol soaked the fabric. She struck another match. Whoosh! The fire didn't just start, it exploded. The curtains went up in a wall of orange and red. The heat was instantaneous, a physical blow. Silas screamed, backing away, clutching his burnt hands. The room was filling with smoke, thick, black, choking smoke. "Open the door," he screamed, coughing. "Open the door." Ada stood by the locked door. The fire was reflecting in her eyes, making them look like they were made of molten gold. She watched him panic. She watched him turn into a coward. And then, as the flames licked the ceiling and the paint began to peel, she did it again. She opened her mouth. And through the roar of the fire, through the crackling of the wood, Silas heard a voice. It was not a whisper this time. It was a scream, but it didn't come from her throat. It seemed to come from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. Burn. It was a command from hell itself. Silas lunged for her, but the smoke took him. He fell to his knees, gasping, choking, the heat searing his lungs. He looked up one last time. Ada was gone. The door was open. She had slipped out into the night, leaving him alone with the fire he had kindled years ago, the fire of his own hate, now finally consuming him. This was only the beginning. The fire would take the house. But Ada was loose in the world now, and she had a lot of work to do. The silence was over. The reckoning had begun. The fire was a living thing behind her. It roared and spat, eating the history of the Thorn plantation one timber at a time. Ada did not look back. To look back is to invite the past to catch you, and Ada was done with the past. She was running toward the only thing that frightened white men more than a rebellion, the swamp. The great cypress swamp was a black, watery mouth waiting to swallow anyone foolish enough to step inside. But Ada was not foolish. She was desperate, and desperation makes a person kin to the wild things. Her feet were bare. The ground was a tangle of roots and sawgrass that sliced at her skin, but she felt no pain. Adrenaline is a powerful drug. It numbs the body and sharpens the mind to a razor's edge. The night air was thick, suffocating, filled with the smoke of the burning house and the ancient, rotting smell of the marsh. She could hear them behind her, the shouts of men waking up to chaos, the clang of the alarm bell, the confused barking of the dogs. They would be coming. Silas Thorn was not a man to die easily. Evil has a way of clinging to life when good men perish. She knew he was alive. She could feel it in the scar tissue of her mouth. He was burned, yes. He was broken. But he was alive, and he would be coming for her with everything he had left. She hit the water line. Swamp didn't start gradually, it simply took the land away. One step was mud, the next was black water up to her knees. It was cold, shockingly cold compared to the fire she had left behind. She waded in. The water was heavy, dragging at her skirts. She stopped, ripping the heavy cotton fabric of her dress up to her thighs, tying it in a knot. Modesty was for the civilized world. This was the primal world. Here, survival was the only virtue. The sounds of the swamp at night are not peaceful. They are a language of warning. The splash of a gator sliding off a log, the screech of a night heron, the low, vibrating hum of a million insects looking for blood. To a runaway, these sounds are terrifying. Every splash sounds like a boot step. Every shadow looks like a man with a gun. But Ada forced herself to breathe. She forced herself to become part of the noise. She wasn't an intruder here. She was a refugee seeking asylum in the mud. Back at the plantation, the scene was apocalyptic. The manor house was a skeleton of flame against the night sky. Silas Thorn had been dragged out by the overseer, a man named Crutchfield. Silas was unrecognizable. His hair was singed off, his clothes melted to his skin in patches, his face a mask of blisters and soot. But his eyes were untouched. They were two manic white orbs staring out of a charred skull. He sat on the grass, coughing up black phlegm, watching his legacy burn. "She did this," he rasped. His voice was a ruin damaged by the smoke. "The silent bitch, she did this." Crutchfield was checking him for broken bones. "We need to get you a doctor, Mr. Thorn. The burns are bad." Silas shoved him away with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a man in his condition. He stood up swaying, a demon rising from the pit. "No, doctor, not yet. Bring me the dogs, bring me the rifles." "Sir, she's gone into the swamp. No one comes out of there at night. The gators." "I don't care about gators," Silas screamed, the skin on his face cracking with the effort. "I want her found, I want her dragged back here. I want to peel the skin from her bones while she watches. Get the dogs." So the hunt began. It was madness. A burned man leading a pack of terrified overseers and baying hounds into a labyrinth of cypress knees and black water. They carried torches, slashing jagged lines of orange light through the oppressive darkness. The dogs were frantic, confused by the smell of smoke and the overwhelming scent of the swamp water. But they caught a trail, the scent of lye soap, the scent of fear. They pulled at their leashes, dragging the men into the muck. Ada heard them. The baying of hounds is a sound that lives in the nightmares of every enslaved person. It is the sound of impending death. It cut through the humidity closer than she expected. She was moving too slow. The water was waist deep now, filled with hidden snags that tripped her. She fell, splashing heavily, swallowing a mouthful of the brackish, foul water. She gagged, choking, unable to cough loudly for fear of being heard. She pulled herself up on a cypress root, gasping for air through her nose. She needed to hide her scent. She remembered the stories the elders told. The water helps, but not enough. The dogs can smell the fear on the wind. She reached down into the muck, grabbing handfuls of the stinking black mud. She smeared it over her arms, her face, her neck. It was cold and slimy, filled with decaying leaves and things she didn't want to think about. But it masked the smell of the human. She became a creature of the mud. She moved deeper. The canopy overhead was so thick it blotted out the moon. It was absolute darkness. She had to feel her way, hands outstretched, touching the rough bark of trees, the slick leaves of palmettos. Something brushed against her leg, something large and muscular. She froze. A splash, then silence. An alligator. She was walking in their living room. If she panicked, if she thrashed, she was dead. She stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The moment stretched into an eternity. Then the presence moved on, sliding away into the deep water. Ada exhaled. She was not the prey tonight, not for the gators. The torches were visible now, flickering lights dancing through the trees behind her. They were maybe half a mile back, but moving faster than she was. They had boats. Flat-bottomed skiffs that could glide over the shallow water. She heard Silas's voice, distinct even in its ruin. He was shouting orders, cursing the men, cursing God. The sound of his voice triggered a cold, focused rage in her. He wouldn't die. He just wouldn't die. She saw a small island ahead, a hammock of dry land rising out of the water. It was covered in dense brush and twisted vines. She scrambled up the bank, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She needed to rest just for a moment. She crawled into the center of a thicket of saw palmettos, curling into a tight ball. The thorns scratched her, but she welcomed the pain. It kept her awake. From her hiding spot she watched. The lights were getting closer. The dogs were losing the scent in the deep water, paddling in circles, yelping in frustration. Silas was in the lead boat, holding a torch high. The light illuminated his face, and Ada felt a jolt of pure horror. He looked like a monster from a nursery tale. His skin was raw and weeping, his eyebrows gone, his lips pulled back in a rictus of pain and hate. He was scanning the banks, his eyes darting frantically. "She's here," he screamed at the dark. "I can smell her. You hear me, Ada? I know you're there. You think the swamp will save you. I own this swamp. I own the trees. I own the mud. There is nowhere you can go where I won't find you." He was losing his mind. The pain and the shock were shattering whatever sanity he had left. But that made him more dangerous, not less. An unpredictable enemy is the hardest to fight. Ada looked around her. She was cornered. If she went back in the water, they would spot the ripples. If she stayed, the dogs would eventually wind her. She needed a weapon. She had nothing. No knife, no gun, just her hands and her wits. Her eyes landed on a heavy, fallen branch of oak. It was jagged at one end, broken off in a storm. It wasn't much, but it was solid. She also saw something else. Nest, not a bird's nest. A mound of earth and rotting vegetation near the water's edge, a gator nest, and the mother was nearby. Ada had nearly stepped on her earlier. A plan, desperate and terrifying, began to form in her mind. It relied on the arrogance of men. Men like Silas didn't look at the ground, they looked at the horizon. They didn't fear nature, they thought they had conquered it. Ada picked up a stone. She waited. The boat carrying Silas was drifting closer to the bank, closer to the nest. The men were arguing. "Boss, we need to turn back. The lanterns are running low on oil if we get stuck out here in the dark." "Shut up," Silas roared. "Push the boat in. There, that hammock, check it." They pushed the skiff toward her island. The nose of the boat crunched into the mud just a few feet from the gator nest. The mother gator was submerged, invisible, but Ada knew she was watching. Gators are patient, but they are fiercely protective. Ada waited until the man in the front of the boat stood up to jump ashore. He was holding a lantern. She threw the stone, not at the man, at the nest. Thwack! The stone hit the mound of earth with a dull thud. Instant chaos. The water exploded. The mother gator, 12 feet of armored muscle and teeth, launched herself from the shallows. She didn't know what hit her nest, she just knew there were intruders. She slammed into the side of the skiff with the force of a battering ram. The wood splintered. The man with the lantern was thrown backward, the glass globe shattering, setting the bottom of the boat on fire. The men screamed. The dogs in the water went into a frenzy. The gator wasn't done. She thrashed, her massive tail sweeping across the deck, knocking another man into the black water. Silas was thrown against the gunwale, his burned skin scraping against the rough wood. He howled, dropping his torch into the water. Shoot it," he shrieked. Gunfire erupted. Flashes of light popped in the darkness, blind shots fired in panic. They were shooting at shadows, shooting at the water. The gator dragged the man she had knocked over under the surface. His scream was cut short, replaced by a frantic bubbling. Ada didn't watch the slaughter, she ran. While they were fighting the dragon they had disturbed, she slipped off the backside of the island, sliding silently into the water. The chaos behind her was her cover. The gunshots masked the sound of her swimming. The screams of the men masked her own gasping breath. She swam until her arms felt like lead. She swam until the sounds of the fight faded into a dull murmur in the distance. She pulled herself up onto another bank, miles away now. She collapsed onto the moss, her chest heaving. She was alive. She had used the swamp as a weapon. As she lay there, staring up at the canopy, the clouds broke. A single beam of moonlight filtered down, illuminating her hands. They were covered in mud and blood, not her own. She looked at them. These were not the hands of a house servant anymore. These were the hands of a survivor, a warrior. She touched her mouth. The scar was tight, painful. She realized then that Silas was right about one thing. She had changed. The Ada who poured wine was dead. She had burned up in that house. The woman who rose from the water was something new. She sat up. She was alone in the wilderness. She had no food, no shelter, and the most powerful man in the county wanted her head. But for the first time in her life, she felt a strange, cold sensation in her chest. It wasn't fear, it was power. She remembered the look on Silas's face when the gator hit the boat. The terror. The realization that he was not the master of this world. He was just meat. Ada stood up. Her legs were shaky, but they held. She wringed the water out of her skirt. She didn't know where she was going. North, maybe. Toward the Union lines, or maybe deeper into the swamp to the maroon camps she had heard whispered about, communities of runaways who lived free in the heart of the darkness. She chose the swamp. The Union was a war of white men. She wasn't ready for that yet. She needed to learn how to be this new creature. She started walking, moving deeper into the Cypress Cathedral. But the night wasn't over. Silas Thorne had survived the fire. He would likely survive the gator. Hate is a powerful anchor. And as Ada walked, she knew that this wasn't the end of the hunt. It was just the end of the first round. Somewhere behind her in the dark, a man was bleeding and burning, swearing an oath to the devil that he would find her. And somewhere ahead of her, destiny was waiting with bared teeth. She walked on, silent as a ghost, into the belly of the beast. The silence was her shield. The darkness was her cloak. And Florida in 1861 was a hell of a place to die, but a perfect place to be reborn. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the trees, Ada saw something hanging from a low branch ahead. She froze. It was a small, crude charm made of twigs and feathers. A warning or a signpost. She reached out and touched it. It spun slowly in the stagnant air. It was a marker. Someone else was here. Someone who knew the swamp better than Silas, better than the gators. She stepped past the marker. The air changed. The smell of rot faded, replaced by the faint scent of wood smoke. Not the acrid smoke of a burning house, but the gentle, controlled smoke of a campfire. Ada slowed her pace. She entered a small clearing, and there, sitting on a log, watching her with eyes that had seen 100 years of sorrow, was an old woman. She held a pipe in her mouth, unlit. A musket lay across her lap. She didn't look surprised. She looked at Ada, taking in the mud, the blood, the fear set of her jaw. The old woman nodded slowly. She tapped the space beside her on the log. "Took you long enough, child," the woman said. Her voice was like dry leaves rustling. "We heard the house go up. We saw the smoke. We knew a storm was coming." Ada stood still. She pointed to her mouth, then shook her head. The old woman chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "I know, you don't need a tongue to tell a story, girl. Your eyes are screaming loud enough to wake the dead. Sit down. The white devil is still behind you, but he won't cross my perimeter, not tonight." Ada sat. For the first time in 24 hours she closed her eyes. She was safe for now. But as she drifted into a restless sleep, the image of Silas Thorne's burning face burned behind her eyelids. He wasn't done, and neither was she. The war had just moved to a new battlefield, and this time Ada had allies. The swamp by day was a different world than the swamp by night. By night, it was a place of monsters and shadows. By day, it was a cathedral of light and green. The sun filtered through the canopy in shafts of gold, illuminating dust motes that danced in the humid air like tiny spirits. Ada woke to the smell of roasting fish and chicory coffee. For a moment, just a heartbeat, she forgot. She reached up to touch her face, expecting the smooth skin of a girl who slept in a house. Her fingers found the mud, the scratches, and the hard, raised line of the scar on her mouth. Then she remembered. She wasn't a girl anymore. She was a fugitive. The camp was a miracle of camouflage. It was built on a series of raised hammocks, hidden so deep in the cypress maze that you could walk right past it and see nothing but vines and moss. There were huts made of palmetto fronds, woven so tight they kept out the rain. There were fires burning in pits dug deep into the earth to hide the smoke. And there were people, men with brands on their cheeks, women with missing fingers, children who had never seen a white man and looked at the world with eyes that were fiercely, impossibly free. This was the kingdom of the Maroons. The old woman who had found her was named Ma'am Zora. She was the spine of this place. She moved with a slow, deliberate power, her hands always busy weaving baskets or cleaning herbs. She sat Ada down by the fire and handed her a tin cup of bitter coffee. "Drink," she said. "Swamp takes the weak first. You got fire in you, girl, I saw it, but fire needs wood to burn." Ada drank. The liquid was hot and shocking to her empty stomach. She looked around. A man was sharpening a machete on a stone. He was huge, his back a tapestry of old whip scars that had healed into thick keloid ridges. He caught her looking and nodded. His name was Cyrus. He didn't smile. In this place, smiles were rare currency, saved for moments of true safety, and they were never truly safe. Days turned into weeks. Ada healed. Her body, once soft from housework, grew lean and hard. She learned the language of the swamp. Cyrus taught her how to walk without breaking a twig, how to slide through the water without making a ripple. Ma'am Zora taught her which berries would heal a fever and which would stop a heart in 10 beats. But the most important lesson she learned was about her silence. At first, the others were wary of it. A woman who cannot speak is a mystery, and mysteries are dangerous. They watched her. They waited for her to break, to cry, to make some sound of distress, but she never did. She communicated with her hands, with her eyes, with the tilt of her head, and slowly the fear turned into reverence. They began to see her silence not as an injury but as a discipline. When the scouts went out to check the perimeter, they wanted Ada with them. She heard things they missed. She saw things they ignored. Her world had become entirely visual and tactile. She was a hunter now. But while Ada was becoming a ghost, Silas Thorne was becoming a devil. He had survived the fire and the gator, but not without a cost. He was living in the overseer's cottage, the only building left standing on the plantation. His face was wrapped in bandages that he changed himself, refusing to let anyone see what lay beneath. The pain was his constant companion. It lived in his nerve endings, a screaming chorus that whiskey could no longer silence. But the pain focused him. He had stopped caring about the war. He had stopped caring about the crops. He had liquidated his assets, sold off the remaining livestock, and used every penny for one purpose. He hired a man named Jean-Baptiste. Jean-Baptiste was not a slave catcher. That was too small a word for what he was. He was a tracker from the Louisiana bayous, a man who hunted men for sport as much as for coin. He was small, wiry, with skin like tanned leather and teeth filed into points, a vanity he had picked up from a tribe he had lived with and later betrayed. He arrived at the plantation on a mule, carrying a long-barreled Whitworth rifle and a bag of tools that clinked with a sinister metal sound. Silas met him on the porch. The meeting of two monsters. "They say you can find a needle in a haystack," Silas said, his voice a rasping wheeze through the bandages. Jean-Baptiste spat a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the dusty floorboards. "I can find the needle, monsieur, and I can tell you who put it there. It's a girl, a mute, she's in the great swamp." Jean-Baptiste laughed. It was a high, yipping sound like a coyote. "The swamp, that is my backyard, but the swamp is big, and runaways they are like rats, they hide deep." "I don't care how deep." Silas slammed a bag of gold coins onto the railing. The sound was heavy, solid. "She took my tongue. She took my house. I want her back, alive if possible, but if she fights, bring me the head." Jean-Baptiste weighed the bag. He smiled, revealing the filed teeth. "For this much gold I will bring you the head, the hands, and the story of her last breath." The hunt changed then. It was no longer a chaotic chase with dogs and shouting men. It became a chess match. Jean-Baptiste didn't rush. He moved slowly. He found the broken twig Ada had snapped 3 weeks ago. He found the faint impression of her foot in the mud where the rain hadn't quite washed it away. He was closing in on the maroon camp, tightening the noose day by day. Ada felt it. It was a prickling on the back of her neck. The birds stopped singing in the southern quadrant of the swamp. The wind carried a scent that didn't belong: oil, metal, and old tobacco. She tried to warn Cyrus. She drew pictures in the dirt, a man with a long gun, a snake closing in. Cyrus frowned. He knew the white men were looking, but he believed the swamp was impenetrable. "We are safe here, sister," he whispered, resting his hand on his machete. "Ma'am Zora has put wards on the trees. No white man can cross the line." Ada looked at him with pity. Wards worked on spirits. They did not work on men like Jean-Baptiste. That night the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. The camp was asleep. Ada sat by the dying embers of the fire, sharpening a piece of iron she had fashioned into a knife. Couldn't stay. If she stayed, she would lead the wolf right to the sheep. The only way to protect these people, the only people who had shown her kindness, was to draw the predator away. She stood up. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't say goodbye. She walked to Ma'am Zora's hut and left a single object on the stoop, a small wooden carving of a bird she had whittled, a bird with no beak. She slipped into the water. It was colder than before. Winter was coming to Florida, stripping the warmth from the air. She swam away from the high ground, back toward the danger, back toward the plantation. She wasn't running away this time. She was circling back. She found the trackers camped 2 miles out. It was a small, neat affair. A hammock strung between 2 trees, a small fire that gave off almost no smoke. Jean-Baptiste was asleep, his rifle propped against the tree within arm's reach. Ada watched him from the reeds. She could kill him now. She could slide out of the water and cut his throat before he opened his eyes. But then she saw something else. Beside the sleeping tracker, tied to a cypress knee, was a dog, not a hound. A bloodhound, old and scarred, sleeping with one eye open. The dog lifted its head, it sniffed the air. It didn't bark, it whined, a low, mournful sound. Jean-Baptiste was awake instantly. He didn't move his body, only his hand, which closed around the pistol on his chest. "Who is there?" he whispered to the dark. Ada froze. She was 20 feet away, submerged to her chin. "Mount, little ghost," Jean-Baptiste crooned. "I know you are there. The dog knows. Do you think you can hide from the man who hunted the Seminole chief Billy Bowlegs? I can smell your blood." He sat up, aiming the pistol at the reeds. Ada had a choice: fight and die here, or run and lead him into a trap. She chose the trap. She picked up a piece of driftwood and threw it hard to her left. Splash! Jean-Baptiste fired. The shot was deafening in the silence. The bullet tore through the water, missing her by inches. Ada dove. She swam deep, hugging the bottom, pulling herself along the roots. She heard the man cursing, heard the splash of him entering the water, the dog splashing behind him. "You want to play?" he shouted. "Good, I like games." Ada surfaced 50 yards away, gasping for air. She wasn't heading for the deep swamp anymore. She was heading for the devil's throat, a patch of quicksand and sinkholes that even the gators avoided. If he wanted to follow her, he would have to walk through hell to do it. Back at the plantation, Silas sat on the porch in the dark. He held a mirror in his bandaged hand. He peeled back the gauze on his cheek. The skin was red, shiny, melted like wax. He touched it. He felt nothing. The nerve endings were gone. Soon, he whispered to his reflection. It was the only word she had spoken to him, and now it was the only word he spoke to himself. He didn't know that Ada was no longer just prey. He didn't know that in the darkness of the swamp she was forging a weapon out of his own hatred. She was leading his hired killer into the earth itself, and when she was done with him, she would be coming for the master. The wind picked up, whistling through the ruins of the house. It sounded like a woman screaming, or maybe it sounded like a woman laughing. Silas couldn't tell the difference anymore. The Devil's Throat was not a place on any map. It was a scar on the face of the swamp, a cluster of sinkholes masquerading as solid ground, covered by a deceptive carpet of bright green duckweed. The locals knew it. The gators knew it. But Jean-Baptiste, for all his bayou wisdom, was a stranger to this specific hell. He was following the splash, following the ghost. His bloodhound was whining, digging its paws into the mud, refusing to go forward. But Jean-Baptiste was a man driven by ego and the promise of gold. He dragged the dog, cursing it in French, his eyes scanning the darkness for the girl. Ada was there. She was crouched on the low limb of a cypress tree, 10 feet above the black water. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was waiting. She held her breath, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs. She watched the lantern light bobbing through the mist. She watched the man step onto the mat of green weeds. She saw the moment the earth betrayed him. It didn't happen like in the stories. There was no dramatic scream, no sudden drop. It was a slurping sound. The ground simply turned to liquid. Jean-Baptiste took a step and his boot didn't stop. He sank to his knee instantly. He tried to pull back to shift his weight, but the suction of the muck was absolute. It was like the swamp had opened a mouth and tasted him. "Merde," he hissed, dropping the lantern. The glass didn't break, but the light tilted crazily, casting long, warped shadows against the trees. He thrashed. That was his mistake. The Devil's Throat feeds on struggle. The more he fought, the deeper he went. The mud was up to his waist in seconds. The dog, sensing the doom, snapped its leash with a frantic lunge and scrambled back to solid ground, barking wildly at the sinking man. Jean-Baptiste reached for his rifle, the beautiful, long-range Whitworth he had carried for years. But he couldn't hold it and fight the mud at the same time. He threw it toward a cluster of roots, hoping to retrieve it later. It landed with a clatter on the wood just out of his reach. Ad looked down. She saw the panic set in. She saw the moment the arrogance evaporated, replaced by the primal terror of a man being buried alive. He looked up. He saw her. Perched like a vulture in the tree, her face smeared with mud, her eyes reflecting the dying lantern light. "Help me," he screamed. "Girl, help me. I'll give you the gold. I'll give you the gun." Ada didn't move. She didn't blink. She watched him with the cold curiosity of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. She remembered the knife in her mouth. She remembered the taste of her own blood. She remembered the sound of Silas laughing. Mercy was a language she had forgotten how to speak. The mud was at his chest now. It squeezed the air out of his lungs. He was sobbing, begging, bargaining with God and the devil in the same breath. "Please, I am just a man doing a job, please." Ada climbed down from the tree. She moved silently along the roots, hovering just above the mire. She reached out. Jean-Baptiste's eyes widened with hope. He reached his hand toward her, his fingers grasping at the air. But Ada didn't take his hand. She reached past him. She picked up the Whitworth rifle. It was heavy, smelling of oil and death. She checked the action, loaded. She picked up his powder horn and his pouch of shot. She slung them over her shoulder. Then she stood over him. She looked him in the eye. She placed a finger to her lips. "SHHH." It was the only sound she made. Jean-Baptiste screamed one last time as the mud took his chin, then his mouth. The scream turned into a gurgle, bubbles popping on the surface of the black slime. Then nothing. Just the green weeds settling back into place, looking as innocent as a meadow. The swamp had eaten the hunter. Ada looked at the dog. The old bloodhound was shivering, tail tucked between its legs. It looked at Ada, then at the spot where its master had vanished. It didn't growl. It whined, a low, submissive sound. Ada knelt. She extended a hand. The dog sniffed her palm. It smelled the mud, the blood, and the gunpowder. It licked her hand. It had a new master now. Back at the plantation, the sun rose on a world that felt empty. Silas Thorne sat on his porch, his coffee cold in the cup. He had been waiting all night for the sound of a gunshot or the triumphant return of the Cajun with a severed head in a bag. But the morning brought only silence. The birds were singing, indifferent to his rage. The wind rustled the scorched leaves of the oak trees. By noon, Silas knew. Jean-Baptiste wasn't coming back. The swamp had taken him. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at Silas's gut. If the tracker was dead, that meant she was winning. It meant she was more than just a runaway. She was becoming a force of nature, and he was alone. The overseers were terrified. Half of them had fled after the fire, afraid of the ghost woman. He had no army. He had no walls. He stood up, kicking the chair over. He wouldn't hide. He wouldn't cower in the ruins of his life waiting for her to come for him. If she wanted a war, he would give her a war. He rode into town that afternoon. His face was still bandaged, his hat pulled low. He rode to the courthouse where the home guard was mustered. These were men too old or too young for the Confederate army, but eager for violence. They sat on crates, whittling, spitting, complaining about the blockade and the price of tobacco. Silas walked into their midst like a specter. "I have a problem," he said. His voice was a wreck, but it carried the authority of money and blood. "I have a maroon in the swamp. She's killed a tracker. She's burned my house. And she's armed." The captain of the guard, a man named Miller with a belly that strained his buttons, laughed. "One girl, Mr. Thorne. You need the militia for one girl." "She's not just a girl," Silas hissed, leaning in close. "She's a spark. You know what happens when the others see a slave kill a white man and live? You know what happens when they see a woman burn a plantation and walk away? It spreads like fever. Today it's my house. Tomorrow it's yours. Tomorrow it's your wife, your daughters." The laughter died. Silas knew exactly which buttons to push. Fear. The primal fear of the slave revolt that haunted every white man in the South. He painted Ada not as a victim seeking justice, but as a monster seeking chaos. He turned her into a symbol of their own destruction. "She has a Whitworth rifle," Silas lied or guessed with chilling accuracy. "She's a sharpshooter. She's hunting us. We need to flush her out. Burn the swamp if we have to." By sunset, Silas had 20 men. They were heavily armed, carrying torches, axes, and jugs of kerosene. They weren't hunting a runaway anymore. They were going to war against the wilderness itself. But Ada wasn't waiting in the deep swamp. She wasn't hiding with the Maroons. She knew that's where they would look. She knew Silas would come with fire, so she did the unexpected. She came to him. She had spent the day learning the rifle. It was a complex machine, far different from the simple tools she was used to. But her hands were steady and her mind was sharp. She practiced aiming at knotholes in the trees. She learned how to measure the wind, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger between heartbeats. The dog, whom she had named Shadow, stayed by her side, a silent sentinel. She moved to the edge of the tree line, overlooking the road that led to the plantation. She climbed high into an ancient live oak, settling herself in the crook of a massive branch. The Spanish moss draped around her like a curtain. She was invisible. She saw them coming at dusk. A column of men on horseback, torches blazing, dogs pulling at chains. Silas was at the front. He looked feverish, manic. He was shouting orders, pointing toward the swamp entrance miles away. Ada rested the heavy barrel of the Whitworth on the branch. She looked through the sights. She saw Silas's bandaged face. It would be easy. One shot. Center mass. End it. But death was too easy. Death was a release. Ada didn't want to release him. She wanted to break him. She wanted him to feel the fear he had inflicted on her for years. She wanted to strip him of his power piece by piece. She shifted her aim. She didn't aim at Silas. She aimed at the wagon behind him, the supply wagon carrying the kerosene and the ammunition for their crusade. She exhaled. The world narrowed down to a single point. Crack. The sound of the rifle was like a thunderclap in the clear evening air. The recoil punched her shoulder, but she didn't flinch. Down on the road, the world exploded. The bullet struck the metal band of a kerosene barrel, sparking against the iron. The barrel, already leaking from the rough ride, ignited. The wagon turned into a fireball. The horses panicked, rearing up, screaming. The wagon overturned, spilling burning oil across the road, blocking the path. The militia horses bolted. Men were thrown into the dirt. Chaos reigned. "Sniper!" someone screamed. In the trees. They fired wildly into the woods, their bullets stripping bark off the pines, hitting nothing but air. Silas fought to control his horse. He looked around, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't see her, he only saw the fire. He only heard the echo of the shot rolling over the hills. "She's here," he screamed. "She's watching us." From her perch in the tree, Ada reloaded. Her movements were calm, ritualistic. Pour the powder, drop the ball, ram it home, cap the nipple. She took aim again. This time she aimed at the ground just in front of Silas's horse. Crack! Dirt kicked up into the horse's face. The animal reared again, throwing Silas hard onto the road. He landed in the dust, gasping for breath, his bandages tearing, blood seeping through the white gauze. He looked up at the tree line. He couldn't see her, but he could feel her. She was God's judgment, sitting in an oak tree. Ada didn't fire a third time. She didn't need to. She watched as the militiamen, terrified by the invisible marksman, began to retreat. They weren't soldiers. They were bullies, and bullies do not fight ghosts. They turned their horses and fled, leaving the burning wagon and the screaming Silas in the road. "Come back!" Silas shrieked, crawling in the dirt. "You cowards, come back!" But they were gone. Ada lowered the rifle. She patted Shadow's head. She had turned his army back. She had humiliated him, and she had let him live. For now. She climbed down from the tree, melting back into the shadows. The night belonged to her. The swamp belonged to her. And soon, very soon, the ruins of the Thorn plantation would belong to her too. Silas lay in the dirt, watching the fire of the wagon burn out. He was alone again. But this time he knew the truth. He wasn't the hunter. He was the bait. And the trap was slowly, agonizingly snapping shut. The plantation was no longer a plantation. It was a tomb. The fields, once white with cotton, were overgrown with strange, choking weeds that seemed to spring up overnight. The charred skeleton of the manor house stood against the sky like a black, broken tooth. Silence had reclaimed the land. The songs of the workers were gone. The ring of the blacksmith's hammer was gone. The only sound left was the sound of a man slowly losing his mind. Silas Thorn lived in the overseer's cottage now. It was a small, cramped structure that smelled of mildew and unwashed clothes. He had barricaded the windows with thick planks of oak. He had pushed the heavy dresser against the door. He slept, if you could call it sleeping, with a shotgun across his chest and a lantern burning on the floor. He was terrified of the dark. The dark was where she lived. He had become a prisoner in his own kingdom. The few remaining slaves had fled weeks ago, slipping away into the night while Silas raved and threatened them with a pistol that shook in his hand. He hadn't chased them. He didn't care about them anymore. He only cared about the eyes. He felt them constantly, watching him from the tree line, watching him from the shadows of the barn, watching him through the cracks in the floorboards. Ada was watching. She had built a platform high in a pine tree on the edge of the forest, a crow's nest where she could see the entire property. She sat there for hours, perfectly still, the Whitworth rifle resting across her knees. Shadow, the bloodhound, lay beside her. The dog had grown lean and wild, his loyalty transferring completely to the woman who fed him and spoke to him in signs. Ada wasn't in a hurry. Revenge, she had learned, was a dish best served slowly. It was about peeling away the layers of a man until there was nothing left but the raw, shivering nerve. She watched Silas stumble out onto the porch in the mornings, squinting at the sun, checking the tripwires he had strung around the yard. She watched him drink his breakfast from a bottle. She watched him shout at the crows. She began the dismantling of his mind with small things. Psychological cuts. When Silas went to the well to draw water, he would find the bucket missing. He would search for an hour, cursing, sweating, only to find it hanging from a branch in the old oak tree, swinging gently in the wind. Inside the bucket, there would be a single charred piece of wood from the manor house. A reminder. One night, while he was in a drunken stupor, she slipped past his tripwires. She moved like smoke. She didn't enter the cottage, that was too risky, but she went to the stables. His horse, a fine black stallion named Caesar, was his last connection to the outside world. It was his escape route. Ada didn't hurt the animal, she simply opened the gate. She smacked the horse on the flank, sending it galloping off into the night toward the freedom of the open road. When Silas woke the next morning and found the stable empty, He fell to his knees in the dirt. He didn't scream. He wept. It was a pathetic, broken sound. He was trapped. He would have to walk 10 miles to the nearest town, exposed, vulnerable. And he knew he wouldn't make it. She would never let him leave. That afternoon, the heat broke. A cold front pushed down from the north, bringing a gray, oppressive sky and a wind that smelled of rain and ozone. Silas retreated into the cottage. He began to board up the door from the inside, hammering nails with frantic, uneven blows. He was talking to himself, a continuous muttering monologue. She wants me to run. I won't run. This is my land, my father's land. A mute girl can't take a man's land. It's against the law. It's against nature. He stopped hammering. He heard something, thump, a sound on the roof, heavy, deliberate. Silas froze. He looked up at the ceiling, at the stained wooden planks. Thump, thump, footsteps. Slow, measured footsteps walking across the shingles above his head. Get off my roof. Silas screamed, firing the shotgun blindly into the ceiling. The blast was deafening in the small room. Buckshot tore through the wood, sending splinters raining down on his face. The footsteps stopped. Then a sound that made his blood freeze, a scratching, like fingernails dragging across the wood. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It wasn't Ada on the roof. Ada was in the tree line 300 yards away. She had tied a heavy rock to a rope and thrown it over the limb that hung above the cottage. She was pulling the rope, bouncing the rock on the roof, dragging it across the shingles. It was a simple trick, a child's trick, but to Silas it was a demon walking on his head. He spent the rest of the day huddled in the corner, clutching the empty shotgun, waiting for the roof to tear open. He didn't eat. He didn't drink. He just watched the ceiling. By nightfall, the wind had turned into a gale. The old barn, the only other structure still standing, began to groan. The barn was where Silas had stored the last of the harvest, 50 bales of cotton he had managed to save before the fire. It was his last asset, his retirement. If he could just get it to market, he could start over. He could leave this cursed place. He looked out the peephole he had drilled in the window shutter. He saw a light, a flicker of orange in the darkness. "No," he whispered. "No, please." The light grew brighter. It was coming from the barn. Ada stood inside the barn. The air was thick with the smell of dry cotton and dust. She held a torch. The flames licked at the air, hungry. She looked at the bales stacked high against the wall. White gold, they called it. Blood money, she called it. It represented every lash, every hour of labor, every stolen voice. She didn't hesitate. She touched the torch to the bottom bale. Cotton is flammable, dangerously so. The fire caught instantly, racing up the stack with a terrifying speed. It wasn't a slow burn, it was a consumption. The barn filled with smoke. Ada turned and walked out the back door, slipping into the shadows just as the roof caught. Silas saw the glow turn into an inferno. He kicked the barricade away from the door and stumbled out onto the porch. The heat hit him across the yard. The barn was a pyramid of fire. Sparks were shooting up into the night sky, joining the stars. "My money!" Silas shrieked. He ran toward the fire. He grabbed a shovel, throwing dirt at the base of the flames, a futile, ridiculous gesture. The fire roared at him, pushing him back. "Stop it! Stop burning my life!" He collapsed in the dirt, coughing, his face streaked with soot and tears. He watched it all go. The cotton, the barn, the last hope of a future. He was destitute. He was a beggar sitting in the ashes of a kingdom built on bones. And then he saw her. She wasn't hiding this time. She stood on the far side of the fire, illuminated by the wall of flames. She was wearing the clothes she had stolen from the tracker. A man's shirt, trousers tucked into boots, the rifle slung over her shoulder. She looked like a soldier. She looked like a judgment. Silas scrambled for his pistol. He pulled it from his belt, aiming through the heat waves. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold the weapon. "I see you," he screamed. "I see you, witch," he fired. The shot went wide, lost in the roar of the fire. Ada didn't flinch. She raised her hand. She pointed at him. Then she pointed to the swamp. It was an invitation. A challenge. "Come to me. Come to where the laws of men do not apply." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the firelight. Silas sat there for a long time. The fire burned down to embers. The wind died. The cold returned. Something broke inside him then. The fear finally burned itself out, leaving only a cold, hard resolve. He was done hiding in the cottage. He was done waiting to die. He stood up. He walked back to the cottage. He didn't barricade the door this time. He went to the heavy iron safe in the corner. He spun the dial, the clicks loud in the silence. He opened it. Inside there was no money, just a book, a Bible, and a box of cartridges. He took the Bible. He ripped the pages out one by one, crumpling them into a pile on the floor. He took the lantern and threw it onto the paper. "If I am going to hell," he whispered, "I will not leave a heaven behind me." He walked out as the cottage began to burn. He didn't look back. He checked his pistol. He loaded his shotgun. He took the hunting knife, the same knife he had used that night, and sheathed it at his hip. He walked toward the tree line, toward the swamp. He wasn't Silas Thorne, the master, anymore. He was just a man with a gun and a death wish. He was entering her world now. The civilized world had ended at the fire line. Beyond the trees, there was only the primitive law of blood for blood. Ada was waiting for him a mile in. She heard his clumsy progress, the snapping of twigs, the heavy breathing. She was up in the canopy, moving through the trees like a squirrel. Shadow was on the ground, silent, tracking him. She felt a strange sensation. It wasn't triumph. It was heavy, like a stone in her gut. This was the end. She knew it. One of them would not leave this swamp. She touched the scar on her mouth. She remembered the taste of the copper. She wanted him to suffer. But more than that, she wanted him to understand. She wanted him to feel the silence. She didn't shoot him, not yet. She wanted him deeper. She wanted him in the Devil's Garden, the place where the old cypress trees grew so thick they blocked out the sun even at noon. The place where the water was deep and black and full of things that had been hungry since the beginning of time. She dropped a token for him to find. A piece of white lace, torn from the apron she used to wear. She draped it over a bush. Silas found it. He snatched it up, crushing it in his fist. "I'm coming, Ada," he rasped. "I'm coming to fix you again." He plunged deeper into the muck. The water rose to his knees. The thorns tore at his clothes. He was walking into the belly of the beast, guided by hate, blinded by rage. And high above him, the silent girl watched and waited and prepared the final lesson. The Devil's Garden was the heart of the swamp, but it beat with a rhythm that was all its own. Here the trees were not just old. They were ancient, their roots twisted into shapes that looked disturbingly like human limbs in agony. The moss didn't just hang. It draped like funeral shrouds, thick and gray and heavy with dust. The air was stagnant, devoid of the wind that moved the rest of the world. It was a place where time didn't pass, it simply rotted. And into this cathedral of decay walked Silas Thorne. He was a ruin of a man. The bandages on his face had unraveled, trailing behind him like a broken flag. His skin, exposed to the swamp water and the insects, was inflamed and weeping. He limped heavily, his boots sucking loudly in the muck, a rhythmic squelch that sounded like a heartbeat. Thud suck, thud suck. He held his shotgun tight, his knuckles white, but his eyes were wild, darting from shadow to shadow. He wasn't hunting anymore. He was being herded. He knew it deep down in the lizard brain that controls survival. He knew the lace on the bush was a lure. He knew the open path was a trap. But his pride, that towering, brittle monument to his own ego, would not let him turn back. To turn back was to admit that the girl had won. To turn back was to accept that the world had changed. And Silas Thorne would rather die in the mud than live in a world where he was not the master. "I'm coming," he shouted. His voice was cracked, dry as old parchment. "You hear me, girl? I'm not afraid of your tricks. I'm not afraid of the dark." But the dark didn't answer. The swamp didn't care about his fear. It just watched. As he pushed deeper, the hallucinations began. It started with the sounds. At first he thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. It was a whispering, 1,000 voices, low and indistinct, murmuring just at the edge of hearing. He spun around, raising the gun. "Who's there? Show yourself." Nothing. Just the moss swaying in the still air. Then the voices grew clearer. He heard his father's voice, cold and disappointed. "You lost the land, Silas. You let a woman take it." He heard his wife's voice, weak and feverish. "You never loved anything but your own reflection." And then he heard the other voices. The voices he had tried to silence for decades. The field hands, the house servants, the ones he had sold. The ones he had buried in unmarked graves. They weren't screaming. They were laughing. A low, rolling laughter that sounded like water rushing over stones. "Shut up," Silas roared, swinging the shotgun wildly. "I fed you, I clothed you, I gave you purpose. You were nothing without me." He fired into the trees. Boom. The shot tore through a curtain of moss, revealing nothing but darkness. The recoil knocked him back into a cypress knee, bruising his ribs. He scrambled up, panting, reloading with shaking fingers. He dropped a shell in the mud. He cursed, scrabbling for it, burying his hand in the filth. When he pulled his hand up, he froze. It wasn't a shell he was holding. It was a bone, a small, curved bone, a finger bone. He dropped it with a shriek, wiping his hand on his shirt. He looked at the ground, really looked at it. The mud here was different. It wasn't black. It was gray, mixed with white fragments. He realized with a jolt of nausea where he was. The bone yard. This was where the old overseers had dumped the bodies of those who died of fever or the whip or the simple despair of living. He was standing on a graveyard of his own making. He backed away, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. No, no, this isn't real. She's doing this. She's putting things in my head. He looked up, and there she was. Ada stood on a raised root 20 yards away. She didn't blend in this time. She stood out. The moonlight, filtering through a break in the canopy, hit her like a spotlight. She looked ethereal, a warrior spirit carved from mahogany. She held the Whitworth rifle, but she wasn't aiming it. She was resting it on her shoulder, casual, relaxed. Beside her sat Shadow the hound, his eyes glowing yellow in the dark. Silas brought the shotgun up. "I got you," he whispered. "End of the line." He pulled the trigger, click. A misfire. The shell he had loaded, the one he had fumbled in the mud, was wet. Or maybe God just put his thumb on the hammer. Silas stared at the gun. He racked the slide, ejecting the dud. He pumped another shell in. Ada didn't move, she didn't flinch. She just tilted her head, watching him. He fired again. Boom. The shot went wide, not because he missed, but because his leg gave out. A root, slick and treacherous, had seemingly moved, catching his ankle. He fell face first into the bone-strewn mud. The shotgun flew from his hands, sliding away into a pool of black water. Silas scrambled after it, crawling on his belly. He reached into the water, his fingers brushing the cold steel. But as he grabbed the barrel, a boot came down on his hand. Hard. He yelled in pain and looked up. Ada was standing over him. She wasn't ethereal now. She was solid, heavy, real. She pressed her boot down, grinding his knuckles into the mud. She looked down at him with eyes that were devoid of hate. Hate is a hot emotion. Hate implies a connection. Her eyes were cold. They were the eyes of a judge looking at a condemned man. She kicked the shotgun away. It slid deeper into the swamp, lost forever. Silas rolled onto his back, clutching his crushed hand. He looked up at her, defenseless. "Do it," he spat. "Kill me, get it over with. You think I'm afraid to die? I'm a thorn. We don't beg." Ada didn't reach for her rifle. She didn't reach for her knife. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a piece of paper. It was charred around the edges. It was a page from the ledger she had burned, the page that listed her name. Ada House, servant mute. She held it up for him to see. Then she crumpled it in her hand and dropped it onto his chest. She stepped back. She whistled, a sharp, piercing sound. From the shadows of the trees, movement, not spirits, people. Cyrus stepped out, his machete gleaming dully. Malmzora stepped out, leaning on her musket. Then others, runaways, maroons. Men and women Silas had hunted or whose families he had hunted. They didn't shout, they didn't attack. They simply formed a circle, a living wall of witnesses. Silas scrambled to his feet, turning in a circle. He was surrounded. "What is this?" he hissed. "A jury? You think you can judge me? I am a white man. I am a citizen. You are property." Cyrus stepped forward. He was a mountain of a man. He looked at Silas not with anger but with a profound sadness. "We ain't property, Silas," he said, his voice deep and rumbling like the earth moving. "We are the swamp now, and you are just meat." Silas lunged at him, pulling the hunting knife from his belt. It was a desperate, suicidal move. Cyrus didn't even raise his machete. He just sidestepped, catching Silas's wrist in a grip that felt like iron. He twisted. The bone snapped with a loud crack. Silas screamed, dropping the knife. He fell to his knees, cradling his broken arm. The circle didn't break. They didn't rush in to beat him, they just watched. It was the ultimate humiliation. They didn't need to touch him to destroy him. Ada walked into the center of the circle. She stood before him. She pointed to her mouth, the scar, the void. Then she did something that broke him completely. She began to sign, not the simple gestures of a servant, but a language she had created in the silence. Broad, sweeping movements of her hands. She pointed to the sky. She pointed to the earth. She pointed to him. Silas didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. You tried to silence the world. Now the world silences you. She turned to the others. She made a gesture, a waving of the hand. Go. The Maroons faded back into the trees. They didn't want his blood. They wanted his fear. They wanted him to know that he was powerless. Cyrus was the last to leave. He looked at Silas one last time. You are alone, Thorn, truly alone. That is a fate worse than hanging. Then he was gone. Silas was left alone with Ada. You can't leave me here, he screamed. Kill me, have the decency to kill me. Ada looked at him. She shook her head. Death was too quick. Death was an escape. She wanted him to live. She wanted him to survive in the wreckage of his own mind. She turned and began to walk away, deeper into the devil's garden. No, Silas scrambled up, stumbling after her. He couldn't be alone. The voices were coming back. The laughter was starting again. Ada, wait, don't leave me with them. He ran after her. He followed her ghost-like form through the trees. He didn't know where she was leading him, but he knew he couldn't stop. He was tethered to her. She was his only anchor in the madness. She led him to a clearing he had never seen before. In the center of the clearing was a massive sinkhole, a cenote. The water in it was perfectly round, perfectly black and still as glass. It looked like an eye staring up at the moon. Ada stopped at the edge. She turned to face him. Silas skid to a halt. He looked at the water. It smelled of sulfur and ancient earth. What is this? He whispered. Ada pointed to the water, then she pointed to him. You want me to jump? He laughed, a hysterical, jagged sound. You think I'll just jump into the pit for you? Ada didn't move. She just watched him. And then Silas saw it. The water in the sinkhole rippled, not from the wind. From below, something was rising. Bubbles broke the surface. Then a shape. It wasn't a gator. It wasn't a log. It was a cage. An old, rusted iron cage suspended by a chain from a cypress branch that hung over the hole. It was a punishment cage, a relic from the Spanish times used to torture pirates or runaway slaves. It had been submerged for 50 years, forgot. But Ada had found it, and Ada had raised it. Silas stared at the cage. It was small, cramped, covered in slime and weeds. Ada walked over to the tree trunk where the winch was rusted fast. She pulled a pin she had greased and prepared. The cage creaked, swinging slightly over the black water. She looked at Silas. She pointed to the cage. Then she pointed to the woods behind him. Silas turned. The woods were alive, not with people, with wolves. The red wolves of Florida, a pack that had been hunting the perimeter of the swamp. They had smelled the blood from his broken nose, the pus from his burns. They were gaunt, hungry, and their eyes reflected the moonlight in a dozen pairs of glowing dots. They were 10 feet away and closing. The choice was simple. The teeth of the pack or the cage. Silas looked at the wolves. He saw the drool dripping from their jaws. He looked at Ada. She was offering him sanctuary, a sanctuary of iron and water, a prison. You act like you're God, Silas wept. You're the devil. He didn't want to die being torn apart. His vanity, even now, couldn't handle the thought of being eaten like carrion. He walked toward the cage. He climbed into the rusted iron box. It swung dangerously, groaning under his weight. He pulled the door shut. It clicked. Ada walked to the winch. She placed her hand on the lever. Silas gripped the bars. You won't drown me. You won't. You're not a killer. You're just a girl. Ada looked him in the eye. She remembered the taste of the knife. She remembered the silence. She released the brake. The cage didn't plummet. It lowered slowly. Creak, creak, creak. Silas panicked. Stop, stop it. I'll do anything. I'll sign the deed over. I'll leave the state. Stop. The water touched his boots. It was ice cold. Ada, please, I'm begging you. I'm begging you. The water was at his waist. He was screaming now, primal screams that echoed off the trees. Ada stopped the winch. Silas gasped, holding the bars, the water lapping at his chest. He looked up at her, sobbing with relief. Thank you, pull me up, please pull me up. Ada locked the winch in place. She walked to the edge of the sinkhole. She looked down at him, a man in a cage, half submerged in the black water of the underworld. He was safe from the wolves. He was safe from the Maroons, but he was not safe from the silence. She didn't pull him up. She didn't lower him further. She left him there, suspended between the living and the dead. She turned her back on him. Ada, he shrieked. Where are you going? You can't leave me here. The water. The things in the water. Ada walked away. She walked past the wolves, who parted for her as if she were one of them. She walked out of the devil's garden. Behind her, Silas's screams continued, bouncing off the trees, growing hoarse, growing desperate. He was screaming for forgiveness. He was screaming for his mother. He was screaming for death. But the swamp is a place that swallows sound. The trees absorbed his cries. Water dampened his pleas. Ada walked until she couldn't hear him anymore. She walked until the air smelled fresh again. She had not killed him. She had given him exactly what he had given her. She had given him a voice that no one would ever answer. She stopped at the edge of the clearing where the maroons were waiting. The sun was beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of violent violet and blood orange. A new day was breaking over Florida. The war was still raging in the north. The world was still bleeding. But here in the heart of the cypress, the war was over. Ada touched her throat. She felt the vibration of her own breath. She couldn't speak. She would never speak again. But as she looked at the rising sun, she realized she didn't need to. She had roared, but the story wasn't quite finished. There was one loose thread, one final act to close the book on Sela's thorn. Ada turned back toward the sinkhole one last time. She wasn't going back to save him. It was going back to say goodbye, and to leave him with the one thing he feared most, the truth. The sun was fully up now. It burned through the morning mist, turning the gray moss to silver. The swamp was waking up. The cicadas began their sawing drone, a wall of sound that covered the world. Ada walked back to the sinkhole. She moved differently now. There was no urgency in her step, no fear. She walked with the heavy, settled grace of a woman who has finished a long, hard task. Silas was still in the cave. He wasn't screaming anymore. He was huddled in the corner of the iron box, waist deep in the black water. He was shivering, his skin pale and puckered, his eyes vacant. When he saw her, a flicker of hope sparked in his chest, but it was weak, like a match struck in a gale. "You came back," he croaked. His voice was barely a whisper. "I knew you would. You're a good girl, Ada. Deep down, you're a good girl." He was bargaining with a ghost. He was trying to charm a hurricane. Ada stood at the edge of the pit. She looked down at him. She felt a strange detachment. He looked so small down there, so insignificant. The monster who had dominated her life, who had cut the tongue from her head, was just a wet, broken old man in a rusty box. She reached into her pocket one last time. She didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. Silas froze when he saw it. His eyes widened, the whites showing all around the iris. He knew that locket. He hadn't seen it in 20 years, not since he gave it to a woman named Sarah, a woman he owned, a woman he had used and then discarded when she became inconvenient. Ada held the locket over the water. It caught the sunlight, gleaming like a star. She opened it. Inside, there was a miniature portrait, a painting of a young man with arrogant eyes and a cruel mouth. It was Sela's. She snapped it shut. The click echoed in the clearing. She dropped it. It fell through the air, tumbling end over end. Plop. It landed in the water inside the cage, splashing Silas's face. He scrambled for it, plunging his hands into the muck at the bottom of the cage. He found it. He brought it up, clutching it to his chest as if it were a holy relic. He opened it with trembling fingers. He looked at the face, his face. "Where?" he gasped, looking up at her. "Where did you get this?" Ada watched him. She didn't sign, she didn't gesture, she simply let him do the math. She let him connect the years. Sarah. The child Sarah had birthed in the quarters. The child he had ignored. The child he had enslaved. The child whose tongue he had cut out because her silence reminded him too much of his own sins. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His mouth fell open, the air left his lungs. "No," he whispered. "No, you're." He couldn't say the word was daughter. Ada nodded, once. A slow, solemn affirmation. She wasn't just a slave rebelling against a master. She was his own blood rising up to drown him. He hadn't just tortured a servant, he had mutilated his own child. The horror of it, the biblical weight of the sin, crushed the last remnants of his sanity. "I didn't know," he wept, clutching the locket. "Ada, I didn't know. It was a lie. He had known, or he had suspected. And that was why he hated her. That was why he needed her silent, because every time she spoke with his voice." Ada turned away. She was done. There was nothing left to take from him. He had his life, he had his cage, and now he had his truth. "Don't go," Silas screamed, the sound tearing his throat. "Daughter, don't leave me, I'm your father." Ada didn't break stride. She walked past the winch. She walked past the wolves who watched her go with yellow, knowing eyes. She walked out of the devil's garden. Behind her, the screaming changed. It wasn't a scream of fear anymore. It was a scream of grief. A scream of absolute, crushing regret. But the swamp is indifferent to regret. The swamp only cares about what is buried and what survives. Ada walked for days. She left the swamp behind. She walked north, following the North Star, just as the old song said. She passed through towns burned by the war. She passed columns of Union soldiers, blue-coated men marching south to finish what had begun. They looked at her, a tall, scarred black woman with a Whitworth rifle and a bloodhound at her heel, and they stepped aside. They saw the war in her face. She never spoke a word to them. She didn't have to. She joined the contraband camps behind the Union lines. She worked as a scout. She led soldiers through the treacherous terrain she knew better than any mapmaker. She showed them the hidden paths, the supply lines, the weaknesses in the gray armor of the South. She became a legend among the troops. They called her the Silent General. They said she could hear a leaf fall a mile away. They said she couldn't be killed because she had already died once in a fire in Florida. The war ended, the shackles broke. The world turned upside down. Silas Thorne was never found. Or perhaps he was found, but there was no one left to care. The swamp keeps its secrets. Maybe the cage is still there, hanging in the dark, holding the bones of a man who thought he could own the wind. Ada lived. She lived a long, full life. She saw her people vote. She saw schools built from the wood of old whipping posts. She married a man who understood the language of her hands. She had children, and she taught them the value of words. She taught them that a voice is a gift, a weapon, and a right. She never regained her tongue, but she found her voice in other ways. She wrote her story. She carved it into the history of the new world she helped build. And on the final page of her life, as she lay in a bed surrounded by free children and grandchildren, she closed her eyes with a smile. She had won, not by shouting, not by begging, but by enduring. The history books might not remember the name of the girl who burned the plantation. They might not record the specific horror of the night the knife flashed, but the wind remembers, the water remembers. And if you go down to the deep Florida swamps where the cypress knees rise like tombstones from the black water, you can still feel it. You can feel the silence, not the silence of submission, but the silence of a storm that has passed, leaving the world clean. So remember this when you feel powerless. Remember Ada. You can cut the tongue from the mouth, but you cannot cut the truth from the heart. For the loudest scream in history is the one that makes no sound.